promised earlier, it's time for a conversation about the 2013 Hall of Fame class, because it's the first one where there's a lot of controversy. Really the beginning of the performance-enhancing drug era in terms of names on that list. Among the prominent first-timers, Barry Bonds, Sammy Sosa, Craig Biggio, Roger Clemens, Mike Piazza, Curt Schilling. And as you look at that, Jack, what do you think it's going to boil down to, the big issue for voters in that 13 election?
Well, a lot of voters have already set up camps. Some have said that they will vote for players based strictly on their numbers because we don't know who did what when. Other voters have said anybody who has ever tested positive or if there is suspicion, they're not going to vote for those players. And I think you said this is the first time we're having a bunch of players on the ballot, but we've already seen Mark McGwire, Rafael Palmeiro. Those have been test cases, and those players have not gotten high voting totals. That's why when I look at some of the players on those lists and guys who have been connected, a guy like Bonds, a guy like Clemens, a guy like Sosa, I don't see those guys who, based on numbers, should be in the Hall. I don't see them getting it in the first year.
All right, you don't have a vote yet, but you eventually will. What's going to differentiate it for you between some of the names on this list?
Well, I think you have to look. Personally, I will look at each case individually. I think when Jack talks about McGwire and Palmeiro, I don't think they're in the same category as Clemens and Bonds. Palmeiro tested positive in the testing era. That's a strike against him. He'll never be on my ballot. McGwire, a lot of people looked at him as a one-trick pony. He was a big home run hitter, wasn't a very good fielder, wasn't a very good average guy. He didn't do a lot more than hit home runs and walk. Bonds was a three-time MVP before people ever think he started doing any drugs. Clemens, obviously, we know what he did before anybody think he did any drugs. So I think every case is different. People look at Sammy Sosa and say his entire 6 or 7 year spurt there was probably because of them. So I think you just have to look at each one individually and make up your own mind, based on what you feel.
Willie, what side of the fence are you on in terms of this?
I kind of agree with Mark a little bit, and it kind of breaks my heart a little bit because when you talk about the history of the game, that's what's the beauty of it, is being able to compare guys, who was better, who was this, who was that. And again, like you talk about a guy like Barry Bonds, did he do enough before all these allegations came about that he, took performance-enhancing drugs? I think that he probably was Hall of Fame before that, and other guys could be in the same boat. So, it's a tough call, but I think you do have to look at it from an individual standpoint. That's sometimes a slippery slope, but, how else are you going to do it?
I think when you talk about guys being Hall of Famers before, Bonds' and Clemens' names always come up. And one of the arguments that I've developed is I try and take it back to school, and you're in high school, and there are a bunch of students who are headed for the high honor roll. And then one kid decides he's going to cheat. And do you still honor that kid? Do you still make sure that that kid gets the same prestigious honor that the people who didn't cheat get? That's where I have a little bit of an issue with it. So I think it's an unbelievable debate. I think we go back and forth on it. But at the end of the day, I have a Hall of Fame vote, and it's my vote. And my conscience has to feel that when I check that box or don't check that box, that I feel good about it.
I think what people are going to run into, Jack, is aside from Palmeiro, none of these guys tested positive under league rules. Right. And so suspicions, what was in Game of Shadows for Bonds, what was in this testimony for Clemens, whatever it may have been, I think people look at it and interpret it their own way. To me, the Hall of Fame is a museum to look at the history of baseball. Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are two of the greatest players in the history of baseball. How they got there, may or may not have been legitimate, and maybe on the plaque you note, right, involved in performance-enhancing drug scandals or whatever it may be. But to me, you look at, like you said, how do you know there weren't 5 other students in that class that were cheating? Yeah,
it's just unfortunate and unfair because a lot of guys will sneak through the cracks there.
Do you think that Bud Selig, Mark, is going to have to differentiate between that? He's going to have to come out with something where there's something on a plaque, for example?
Well, I think Bud's in the fortunate position of it's not his problem. This is something the Hall of Fame is going to have to do.
Right.
And if the Hall of Fame decides to come out, but I don't think the Hall of Fame is going to want to influence the voting of any way. They're going to leave it up to the writers, the voters to decide. This is your vote. Go do it.
If Mark were the president of the Hall of Fame instead of Jeff Idelson, and he did make an announcement that they would put on, say, Barry Bonds' plaque next to all those numbers we're going to see, and they're numbers that are off the charts, that was involved in the Balco scandal, that would make me feel, okay, now you're honoring history. But to say that everybody who walks through those doors 50 years from now is going to know every last detail, that's where I have a little bit of an issue with it. I want to see the best players in the Hall of Fame, and are Clemens and Bonds among the best players I've ever covered? Absolutely. But I still just have trouble with rewarding a guy who may have cheated.
And here's the other issue with that. Let's say you did put on Bonds' plaque, was involved in the Balco scandal. let's say Jeff Bagwell gets in the Hall of Fame, and right now there's nothing to indicate that he was involved. Let's say he gets in the Hall of Fame, and 10 years later we find out he was involved, and are you going to go change his plaque?
Call the engraver.
Yeah, he might have to do that.
That's what I'm talking about, with the guys sneaking through the cracks. There's a lot of guys, more guys did it than I thought. And if you wait, for years from now to see what, who comes out of the woodwork, it could be very embarrassing, obviously.
Leave a little room on that plaque to add something at the bottom.
Right.
I think I know it's a mess, and it's something that baseball wishes didn't happen. We all know what happened. The Hall of Fame wishes it didn't happen. They would love to just have guys sail in. That's why Barry Larkin this year, the epitome of Cincinnati, this will be the last year where the Hall of Fame kind of gets to really rejoice over the day, because whoever makes it or doesn't make it next year, they have interviews and conference calls, and every question is going to be about performance-enhancing drugs, and this guy didn't make it. Do you think this guy should have made it? This enters into an era that nobody wanted to have to deal with.
And you kind of feel bad for the guys that do make it in next year, because Craig Biggio, maybe Curt Schilling, maybe Mike Piazza, they're going to be answering questions about Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Sammy Sosa on what should be one of the great days of their careers.
All right, so let's talk just a little bit about those guys. You mentioned Schilling and Biggio. Those two guys stand out to me as guys who, by all accounts, are clean, worked hard, put up good numbers. Should those guys be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, Craig Biggio, being a middle infielder, I love Craig Biggio. I mean, his guy was a catcher at one time and made the transition to second base and did a fine job. They got 4 or 5 Gold Gloves, stole bases, hit for power. I love Craig Biggio, a local boy from New Jersey, and I think he's a guy that maybe not made the first time in, but I think eventually he will.
He's got the 3,000 hits. He's got that big, fat, round number, which I think works in his favor. We talked about off the air about compilers and guys who kind of hung around. You look at Craig Biggio's numbers over the last part of his career, weren't great, but he hung around and got the 3,000 hits. So I think eventually he does get in. And I think Schilling is an interesting guy. He's about 70 games over 500, about a 3-something ERA. Didn't win as many games as you would think that a guy would have to win to get in there. But look at some of those numbers, and I just look at what he did in kind of lifting up some teams that you think probably shouldn't have won World Series. That first Diamondbacks team and that first Red Sox team. And I think Schilling is a guy who will eventually get in.
And you look at a 3-time Cy Young runner-up, and I think he was a runner-up to Randy Johnson 2, if not 3 of those times. So it's not like he was losing to just any guy every year. Like Jack said, I think what Schilling did in the postseason lifts him to that next level. And I think you'll see that, with a few guys, not that they're not Hall of Famers, but, Jeter, Rivera, postseason performance is going to be a big factor in getting Jeter to the Hall of Fame along with the 3,000. Schilling, I think you look at his work with Arizona and Boston in October, and that probably pushes him over the edge.